Hello, welcome to Lecture 3, Chapter 18 in your textbook. And this textbook chapter, this module, we're going to be talking about the Americas and the conquest of the Americas by mostly the Spanish, although you'll see that there are other European powers involved here as well. The first thing to point out is what we've already discussed that's having a profound impact on the world at this time, and that is that Columbian exchange. And you read about this as well. You listened to this theme in Guns, Germs, and Steel, the Guns, Germs, and Steel documentary. Okay, in your discussion this week, we're discussing, as a way of introducing some of the themes, we're discussing that quote that you can find at the beginning of chapter 16 on page 601, the one that starts with the Spanish justified conquest of these new continents and their Native American inhabitants with Christ's command to convert the heathen in the Spanish Habsburg world empire, the glorious final empire before Christ's return. They financed, etc., etc., etc. About two more sentences to that. What does that quote mean? I'm not going to talk about it directly here, so we can do that on the discussion board. But let me give you a hint. It's about extracting wealth and resources from the what they called at the time the New World. Okay. Let's talk about the actual peoples of this new world, as they called it, the Americas. And specifically, I want to talk about the conquest of the Aztecs and the Incas. Hernan Cortez is the Spanish explorer here, or the guy who first leads an expedition to the interior of Mexico. Keep in mind that the Aztecs were kind of resented by a lot of their neighbors, because the Aztecs themselves were an imperial power, and because they were an imperial power that demanded that conquered territories pay them, they had a lot of local enemies, and that's one of the things that Hernan Cortez takes advantage of. He takes advantage of the enemies. He makes allies with the Aztecs' enemies. So his army is actually, made up of, I think, as many or even more Native Americans than Spaniards. The other advantage, of course, is the pathogens that we've talked about in the Columbian exchange, the smallpox, and particularly right as Cortez's men arrive, there's a new smallpox epidemic that breaks out in the Aztec city here. This is the current place where Mexico City is today. So he has that advantage. Cortez lays siege to the city once he arrives. It's a city that's located on an island in the middle of a big lake there, high in the mountains of Mexico. As I said, it's still a huge city there today. That city, Mexico City, has been there for about 700-800 years. So he eventually captures the head of the Aztecs, and this is an important part of the story as well, because the Spanish know, in order to defeat quickly these large Native American civilizations, and these weren't just small hunter and gatherer bands; these were large agricultural civilizations, that had grown corn and beans and a variety of other plants that gave them enough food supply to build these massive cities, these huge temples, for example. Well, the Spanish do eventually take the city. They at least lay siege to the city. They don't let anybody in and out. They starve the city kind of into submission. That makes even those diseases worse because it weakens people's immune system. So look over that section in your textbook on Hernan Cortez. The other person that we want to mention here is Francisco Pizarro. He's the Spanish conquistador who goes to South America to the Incas, and with 300 men, he's able to, through much of the same ways by which Hernan Cortez succeeded against the Aztecs, Francisco Pizarro succeeds against the Incas, right? You have the population crash of the Native Americans, the diseases that have already reached there before the Spanish even set foot in those Incan cities. So the Spanish arrive, and at first there's goodwill on the part of Montezuma, or I should say, not Montezuma's, the Aztecs, on the part of the Inca, which is what they call the Incan. The Incan king is the Inca. He's considered to be as a god. And there's goodwill between the Spanish and the Incas, allowing the Spanish army. Well, it's only an army of about 300 men, about 200 horses, but they kind of lay a booby trap almost for the Incas here. They're invited into the city. They spend the night. Then they're supposed to meet with the Inca the next day, and right away, Francisco Pizarro tries to intimidate the Incan king by riding up to him on his horse. Then we only have the white men's account of what happened here. Keep that in mind. Only the Spanish account. But according to the Spanish, the Inca threw the king, the emperor threw the Bible on the ground when it was handed to him. He didn't know what it was. He knew it was something of power to the Spanish, but he didn't have any use for it. And that is when allegedly Francisco Pizarro gives his men the command to essentially to open fire in this plaza, in this kind of middle of this village, this walled-in city, and people are stampeded on, just trying to get out of the way of the Spanish swords as they hack the Native Americans to bits. Really, it's a massacre, and they capture the Inca much the same way that Hernan Cortez had captured Montezuma of the Aztecs. So they go straight to the top of the Native American society in order to conquer them. The Incas also had suffered from a recent civil war. That's another reason why the Spanish were so easily able to conquer them. And this was really a lopsided kind of military battle, you would have thought, 300 soldiers up against 10,000 Incas. But like I said, it was kind of a booby trap. As soon as the Incas are defeated and the Incan Empire is defeated, they demand a big ransom of gold, which is paid. But most of the Spanish agreements or promises aren't honored. And then we have the Spanish setting up their colonial system to extract wealth from the Native Americans and from the land. There's gold and there is silver in Central and South America, and even in Mexico. That's what the Spanish were initially interested in. They start heaping up big piles of gold in the holds of those Spanish galleons that are sent back to Spain. And this is also, we have the rise of piracy and the buccaneers in the Caribbean islands. And what's called the encomienda system is set up. Encomienda, Encomienda. It's in your textbook. Please look at that. This is, that's a Spanish word that kind of translates into English as an engine. Or what's that mean, an engine? Well, actually, it means engines of wealth creation. These were those fortified forts where they used forced labor of Native Americans to start harvesting sugarcane, indigo for dyes. We're a little bit before the coffee revolution, but that will be coming as well. But sugarcane is the main thing they're interested in at this point. This gives way, the encomienda system, this fort of enslaving Native Americans in these within sometimes these military forts. That gives way to a system of rotating labor. This is a way that also impoverishes Native Americans. So when you have these required, demanded rotating labor, so many hours per day, you're supposed to leave your village and go over to a plantation and work. It's not exactly chattel slavery where people are considered property, but it's not a long ways from that. And also think about if you can't work on your own agriculture and for your own family and for your own village, but for somebody else, you have less time. You have less time to spend on your own village and your own family. So you're kind of taking away labor and value and wealth from the Native Americans as you force them more and more labor. And this is the problem. It is a problem of labor shortages because of the crash in the Native American populations. And in fact, the first African slaves are brought to the Americas, and we'll see this in the next chapter. In more detail, but the first African slaves are actually not brought for plantations, but they're brought to be miners to work in the silver mines high in the South American mountains in the early 1500s. I think 1519 is the first documented African slave that is brought to work in those silver mines. Okay. You can read in later sections in the chapter. There is this about the Spanish expansion across South America, the Portuguese, and their pioneer cultures. They're pioneers that are looking, sometimes prospecting for gold. They control the Portuguese control Brazil. The Spanish control much of the rest of South America. And you have the beginning as well of trade in the Pacific between Acapulco in Mexico to Manila in the Philippines up to China. It's like a triangular trade. Most people think about triangular trade in the Atlantic, which we'll talk about next week. But there also was this triangular trade with China. And China actually didn't have very much gold, so they really want gold and silver. So they take that gold and silver to places like China and exchange it for silks. They don't use the Silk Road anymore. Remember, the maritime trade is taking over. We continue to see this boom in maritime trade. Okay. Little differences, some of the differences you'll see between the various colonies in North and South America. The North American settlements were settled not so much by the Spanish, but by the French, by the English, and the Dutch. Now we're talking about this part of the world, the North America, including Virginia and North Carolina. Those regions is largely controlled by the English. Early on, but there were Native American peoples here as well, obviously, and their numbers too had crashed. You can read in your textbook about the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia and extending down to North Carolina, extensive confederation, right? That's a loose association. They were bound together in kind of a small empire, you might call them, of about 2,000 villages, 200 villages rather. And initially their relationships with the English settlements in Jamestown were good, and then too many broken promises. They resist and begin raiding the white settlements at Jamestown, and they are going to be eventually then defeated by the settlers as well. Okay, your chapter ends with the 7 Years' War. And just say a couple of comments about the 7 Years' War. One way to think about the 7 Years' War is actually it's sometimes described as the First World War, kind of like World War I, right? But it's about 150 years before actually World War I occurs. In other words, it's the first real global war. It's fought between 1756 and 1763. On one side, there were the British and the Prussians in Europe. The Prussians, that's in present-day Germany, and Native Americans. Native Americans fought on both sides. This is the same thing that you would learn about in your American history class as the French and Indian War. But that's the larger name for the war is the 7 Years' War. It's fought in Europe, it's fought in North America, it's fought in the Caribbean, and it's fought in India and Asia. So at least 3 major parts of the world, if not 4 parts of the world, and all across the high seas, this war is waged between, on one side, the British and the Prussians and their Native American allies, and on the other side, the French, the Austrians, and their Native American allies. And Native Americans fought on both sides, right? In general, most Native Americans in North America, anyway, sided with the French against the British and the British colonists here because they thought the British would give them a better deal. Colonists here on the continent, they thought the French would give them a better deal. They were very wary of the British colonists, who all they wanted to do from the Native American perspective was to take their land. Okay, so now the British do end winning that war against the French, but both sides really end up very indebted, which is that theme that's coming back again that we mentioned last week. These new armies, you can project power a lot farther now and a lot more destructively, but it costs a lot more, especially also when you're hiring mercenary armies. So both sides end up coming up with these massive debts, and to relieve those debts, they got to raise taxes, and they have to find revenue streams, and the way to find revenue coming into the government is to raise taxes, and that's going to lead to some problems as well. So keep that in mind about the 7 Years' War. The other thing is that Britain gets an expansion of territory in its empire. It now becomes the largest of the empires, getting India, big toehold in the Indian subcontinent. In that part of the world, that was the original target of the spice trade. So it's still important. This time it's going to be more important now for tea than even spices, okay? So there's that. And the British also get Canada. You know, why do a lot of French-speaking people still live in Canada, especially the Quebecois, those people who live up in Quebec who speak French? Used to be a French colony, but at this time it switches from being under the French to being under the British. So British Empire largely increases. Okay, so that's a nice introduction of some of the themes you'll find in this chapter. Also look at the little insert you have in the textbook on Bartholomew Las Casas and the debate that he takes part in about the fate of Native Americans in Central and South America. Okay, I'll see you all next week and virtually online on the discussion boards. All right, thank you.
Stop taking video button.